Boy vanished walking to Grandma's a year later. A trail camera snaps, this at 2 a.m. The autumn evening had a bite in the air as the sun began to set behind the dense trees of Pinewood Grove. It was 9:15 p.m., and the small town of Burden Creek, a sleepy hamlet tucked away between rolling hills and dark forests, was eerily quiet. By all accounts, this was supposed to be just another evening in the remote community. But when 6-year-old Evan Rhodes vanished without a trace, everything changed. It wasn't just the sheer mystery of his disappearance, but the unsettling facts that surrounded it, facts that no one could explain. His mother, Marissa Rhodes, reported Evan missing by 10:00 p.m. after he failed to return from a brief trip to his grandmother's house, just a few blocks away. By morning, the search for Evan was underway. But what was puzzling wasn't just the fact that a child had disappeared into the night, but the details surrounding the case. The search would reveal a number of inconsistencies, contradictions, and strange occurrences that would leave even the most hardened detectives baffled. What had happened to Evan? Where was he, and why was the town so silent about his disappearance? The Rhodes family had been living in Burden Creek for nearly a decade, and their life had been quiet, predictable, until that fateful night. Marissa Rhodes was a single mother, having raised Evan alone since the sudden and unexplained disappearance of her husband Thomas Rhodes a few years earlier. He had gone out for a walk one evening and never returned. No trace, no signs of struggle, just a void where he had been. Marissa had been left with a deep, gnawing sense of loss, but life, as it does, moved on. She threw herself into her work, which involved bookkeeping for a small company, and raised Evan as best as she could. Despite the loss, their life in Burden Creek had been peaceful. Evan, bright and inquisitive for his age, had been a typical child, curious about everything, asking endless questions. Yet there were times when his fascination with the woods, near their home, seemed almost unnatural, and his mother, though never openly alarmed, had occasionally noticed how deeply he seemed drawn to the dense, dark forest that bordered their small neighborhood. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in late October. The air was cold and crisp, and the wind rustled through the fallen leaves. Marissa had been busy preparing dinner when Evan, full of energy, dashed into the kitchen. "Mom, I'm going to Grandma's to take her something," he had said. "Just make sure you're back before it gets too dark." Marissa had warned, not thinking much of it. Evan was 6 years old and had made the trip to his grandmother's house many times. His grandmother, Eleanor Rhodes, lived in a small cottage just at the edge of the forest, about a 15-minute walk from their house. Marissa had never thought twice about the journey. It was safe, or so she thought. "Be careful, okay? Don't talk to strangers and don't wander off into the woods." "Okay, Mom." Evan had grinned and dashed out the door, his small figure disappearing into the twilight. Marissa, already exhausted, returned to her work, assuming her son would be home in a matter of minutes. By 9 p.m., as the last light of day faded into darkness, Marissa glanced at the clock and realized that Evan was late. The night was quiet, unnervingly so. No laughter from children, no cars passing down the street, just the rustling of the trees in the breeze. By 9:15 p.m., her concern turned to unease. Where was he? Marissa grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, calling his name. "Evan," she shouted, walking down the street toward her mother-in-law's house. The small neighborhood was silent. When she arrived at the cottage, she knocked urgently, but no answer. The door was locked. As she peered into the dim windows, she saw no signs of life. Had he been there? Had he even made it? She retraced Evan's steps in her mind. He had only gone down the same familiar path, nothing unusual. But as Marissa walked further into the street, the air grew colder. The quiet, once comforting, now felt unsettling. Her heart raced as her footsteps quickened. Where could Evan possibly be? Frantic, Marissa returned home and immediately called the police. Within an hour, a small team of officers had arrived, led by Detective Sam Walters, a seasoned investigator from the Burden Creek Police Department. "Tell me exactly what happened," Walters had asked, clipboard in hand. I don't know," Marissa stammered. He was supposed to go to his grandmother's house. I didn't think anything could go wrong. Walters nodded, his expression unreadable. Did he take anything with him? A jacket, a flashlight? No, Marissa said. Nothing. He was just supposed to take something to her. The team immediately began to search the area. Neighbors were questioned, and every possible route Evan might have taken was examined, but there was no sign of the child. As the hours passed and the search expanded, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. Evan's path, the route he had taken to his grandmother's house, was covered in thick foliage, but there were no footprints, no signs of his passing. The police combed through the woods near the Rhodes house but found nothing. It was as though Evan had simply disappeared. The search turned into an all-night operation, with volunteers joining the effort, sweeping the nearby forest and canvassing the town, but no clues turned up. Not a single item of clothing, not a footprint, nothing. The police began to question Marissa's story, though they had no reason to doubt her honesty. Why hadn't anyone seen Evan on his way to his grandmother's? The path was usually well traveled, and at that time of night it would have been hard for anyone not to notice a 6-year-old walking alone. The forest and the missing child. The woods surrounding Burden Creek had always held a strange allure, even for the locals. Some whispered that the forest had a mind of its own, drawing people in, especially at night. The area was rich in history, and though the town was small, it had its fair share of dark secrets. Some of the older residents believed the land itself had been cursed, that it held ancient power. Though those were just old tales, stories passed down through generations. But as the search continued and the days dragged on, the questions grew. If Evan hadn't made it to his grandmother's house, then where was he? What had happened to the child? Why hadn't anyone seen him? The strangest part of all was the eerie silence that fell over Burden Creek after Evan's disappearance. People spoke in hushed tones, but no one seemed willing to say much. Local newspapers covered the case, but with little information coming to light, it faded quickly from public attention. The case was classified as an abduction, but no one could determine who might have taken the boy or why. As Detective Walters delved deeper into the investigation, he found himself drawn to a set of strange circumstances surrounding the Rhodes family. His instincts told him something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. As more and more time passed with no leads, the town of Burden Creek began to return to its quiet routine. But for Marissa, nothing would ever be the same. The disappearance of Evan Rhodes had only just begun to reveal its secrets. What was the significance of the strange woods? Why had Evan chosen that exact night to venture out, and most disturbingly, what had happened to him during those crucial hours? In the quiet town of Burden Creek, answers seemed elusive, as if the forest itself had swallowed Evan whole, leaving behind only questions. What had happened to Evan Rhodes? Where had he gone, and why did the town seem to have so many unanswered questions? The mystery was only just beginning. The search for Evan Rhodes continued through the cold, silent nights of late October. Burden Creek, a place that had once felt like a quiet retreat from the world, now seemed to be hiding secrets beneath its serene surface. With every passing hour, the sense of dread in the air thickened. It wasn't just the mystery of the boy's disappearance that unsettled people, but the chilling uncertainty that nothing made sense. Not the timeline, not the people involved, not even the town itself. The first night of searching stretched long into the dark hours, with officers and volunteers scouring the woods near the Rhodes home. But there was something unusual about the woods themselves. Despite being thick and dense, no tracks were found, not even a single sign that a child had walked through. No broken branches, no scuffed leaves, just untouched wilderness. Detective Sam Walters, who had seen his fair share of disappearances in his career, was stumped. This wasn't his first child abduction case, but there was something unsettlingly off about this one. Normally, in a case like this, the first clues would be the easiest to find: a trail, a hint of where the child might have gone. But here it was, as though the land had swallowed Evan whole. For hours, Walters retraced Evan's last known steps, asking Marissa if there were any details she hadn't shared. She was cooperative but weary. He was just supposed to go to his grandmother's, Marissa repeated over and over. He's done it 100 times before. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but the concern in them was unmistakable. She wanted answers, needed them. Are you sure about everything? Was there anything unusual that day? Walters pressed gently. Marissa's face clouded. He was acting a little more anxious than usual, I guess. But I thought it was just because Halloween was coming up. You know how kids get. The detective nodded, noting the details. It wasn't much, but it was the only lead he had for now. Still, something about the whole situation felt off. Why hadn't anyone seen Evan walking toward his grandmother's house? Burden Creek was a small town, and Evan was a familiar face. He couldn't have simply vanished into thin air. The next evening, more officers and volunteers gathered. This time, the search included members of the town's search and rescue team, equipped with thermal imaging drones and tracking dogs. But again, the results were baffling. The dogs picked up no scent, and the drones found nothing, not even a trace of heat where Evan might have been. It was as if he had never been there at all. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that something unnatural had occurred. The more the authorities tried to piece together Evan's route, the less sense everything seemed to make. The forest itself appeared too pristine, almost too untouched for a path that should have been well worn by now. By the third morning, the police had expanded the search even further. They checked nearby houses, questioned more neighbors, and spoke with anyone who might have been out that night. Still, no one had seen the boy. No one had heard a thing. Then on the fourth day, a break came from an unlikely source. A local man named Charlie O'Leary, who lived on the outskirts of Burden Creek near the woods, claimed to have seen something strange on the night Evan disappeared. I saw a figure moving in the trees, O'Leary told Walters, his voice low. Couldn't make out who it was, but it wasn't a grown-up. It was too small. I thought it was a kid at first, but then I wasn't so sure. The man's property was right next to the dense forest, and from there he had a clear view of the tree line. He didn't get a good look at the person, but the way he described it sounded eerily similar to Evan's size and build. You're sure it was a child? Walters asked, jotting down the details. Charlie O'Leary hesitated. I couldn't say for sure, but I'd bet my life on it. They were moving fast, like they were running. Running from what Walters thought, but didn't ask aloud. Something in the man's tone unsettled him. Charlie continued. It was like they were trying to keep low. You know, I didn't see no headlights or nothing, so I figured it was just a kid cutting through the woods playing around. But it wasn't until later that I heard about Evan going missing, and I thought, maybe it was him. It was a small lead, but it was a lead nonetheless. The problem was that Charlie's description was vague, and the timeline didn't match. Evan had been gone for hours by the time O'Leary noticed anything, and that left a wide window for the truth to slip through. The description of the figure, small, moving quickly, and seemingly attempting to hide, raised more questions than it answered. If that figure had been Evan, why had he been running? And what was he running from? Detective Walters couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was unfolding in Burden Creek. Every new detail, every new piece of information seemed to create more gaps, more uncertainty. It wasn't just a missing child. Something about the way Evan had disappeared, the lack of evidence, the strange behavior of those around him, felt like a puzzle that couldn't be solved. As the investigation continued, Walters started to hear whispers around town. People spoke in hushed tones about the forest, about the history of Burden Creek. They said there were places in the woods that were cursed places where the land had a way of taking people and never giving them back. Others spoke of the watchers, shadowy figures said to appear in the trees when something bad was about to happen. Walters knew the town's old folklore was just that, folklore. But there was a gnawing feeling that something was being hidden, something that was more than just a simple disappearance. As he walked back through the woods, himself tracing the path Evan might have taken, the trees seemed to watch him, and in the back of his mind a question lingered. Was there something out there in those woods that no one was talking about? Days turned into weeks, and still there were no answers. The town began to lose hope, and with it any semblance of peace. The search slowed, but Detective Walters couldn't shake the feeling that the case was far from over. Something about the woods about Evan's disappearance didn't sit right with him. More unsettling rumors began to spread, whispering that the Rhodes family had dark secrets, secrets that no one was willing to acknowledge. Marissa's late husband, Thomas Rhodes, had vanished mysteriously a few years prior, and the police had never been able to uncover what happened to him. Some began to wonder if the two disappearances were connected. As Walters continued to dig, the silence of Burden Creek grew thicker, suffocating, as though the town itself was hiding a truth too terrible to face. What had happened to Evan Rhodes? Where was he, and why did no one seem willing to talk about the forest? The clock was ticking, and time was running out. The answers, it seemed, were deeper and darker than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into Evan Rhodes' disappearance reached a critical point. With each passing day, the small town of Burden Creek felt more like a pressure cooker, its simmering secrets threatening to burst open. Detective Sam Walters had been at this long enough to know that when things didn't add up, there was usually something more, something hidden just beneath the surface. As Walters sat at his desk reviewing the case files, his mind kept circling back to one disturbing detail. Thomas Rhodes, Marissa's husband, had gone missing 3 years prior, under eerily similar circumstances. The town had never recovered from that incident, though few dared to speak about it openly. Thomas had been a respected man, a father and a hard-working member of the community, but no one seemed to know what happened to him after he left for a solitary fishing trip at the same secluded lake near the woods. His body was never found. His car was abandoned, parked near the water's edge, and his belongings were left behind as though he had vanished into thin air. There were no signs of foul play, no evidence to suggest that he'd been abducted or harmed. Just like Evan's case, it was as though Thomas had simply disappeared. It didn't take long for Walters to dig deeper into Thomas Rhodes' life. The man's background had always been spotless: a dedicated father, a reliable worker, and a familiar face in the community. But as Walters began to talk to people who had known Thomas well, an unsettling pattern started to emerge. Thomas wasn't the type to just up and leave, said Terry Hill, an old friend of Thomas's, from the local hardware store. He was obsessed with that lake, always talking about fishing there, but he was never one to take risks not like that. Terry paused for a moment, looking over his shoulder, before leaning in closer. There were rumors, though. Nothing solid but whispers. Some people thought he was going to meet someone out there, maybe someone he shouldn't have been meeting. I don't know, Sam, it just didn't sit right with me, especially when I saw him that last time. Walters raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? What did you see? He was nervous. I know that sounds stupid, but he was acting like someone was watching him. He wouldn't say it outright, but there was something off about him. And then, just a few days later, he was gone. Like he just vanished. It wasn't like him. Terry's words echoed in Walter's mind. Could Thomas Rhodes' disappearance and Evan's be connected? Had the Rhodes family been marked in some way? Was there something about this land, about Burden Creek itself, that was drawing people in, only to swallow them whole? The search for Evan had stalled in the days following Walter's conversation with Terry Hill. But the detective wasn't willing to give up. He returned to the woods again, hoping for a new lead, anything to guide him forward. On this particular evening, Walters found himself near the same lake where Thomas Rhodes had vanished. The water was unnervingly still, reflecting the orange and purple hues of the setting sun. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and there was an eerie stillness in the trees. As he walked along the edge of the water, his flashlight caught something out of place. A small, weathered item had washed up along the shore. It was a child's toy, a yellow plastic truck. Walter's heart sank. The toy was unmistakably similar to the ones Evan used to play with. This wasn't just a coincidence. The toy had to have been left there recently. The lake was a few miles away from the Rhodes house, but if Evan had passed through the area, it could explain the toy being left behind. But what was a 6-year-old boy doing out here alone in the middle of the night? As Walters stood by the lake staring at the toy, a chill ran down his spine. His instincts told him that something was wrong, something deeper, something he hadn't uncovered yet. He turned around and walked back toward the woods, feeling the weight of the evening press down on him. And then he saw it again. The figure. A shadow darting between the trees, moving too quickly for Walters to get a clear look. It was small, almost childlike in size, but it wasn't moving like a child. It was too quick, too erratic. Walters froze, watching the figure retreat into the dense underbrush. His first instinct was to chase after it, but something held him back. His mind raced. Was this Evan? Was it someone else? The figure seemed to vanish the moment Walters stepped forward, as though it had disappeared into the very trees themselves. He stood there for a moment, the hairs on his neck standing up the night air, pressing in around him. Whoever or whatever had been out there, it knew the woods better than he did. The more Walters delved into Burden Creek's history, the more he found that the town had always been a place of mystery. There were old stories, whispers passed down through generations about the land that surrounded it. Some spoke of strange disappearances, others of shadowy figures seen at the edge of the forest at night. No one seemed to know where the stories came from, but they all seemed to point to the same place, the forest. It wasn't just the recent disappearances of Thomas and Evan that had residents uneasy. The town had a reputation for vanishing people, some going back centuries. One local historian, Helen Carter, spoke of the Cursed Hollow, a spot deep in the forest where countless people had gone missing over the years. It was said that the land there had been cursed long ago by the indigenous tribes who once lived in the area. But these were just rumors buried in time. There's something about the woods, Helen said, her voice low. People have always gone missing out there. The stories go back as far as anyone can remember. Sometimes I think the land itself is hungry. It takes people when it wants them. It doesn't matter who they are. The more Walters heard, the less he could dismiss these tales as mere superstition. There were too many similarities in the way people disappeared, too many links between the cases, both old and new. The lake, the woods, the eerie quiet, it all seemed to tie together. As Walters connected the dots between Thomas's disappearance, Evans, and the strange happenings in Burden Creek, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Could it be that there was someone out there in the woods waiting for the right moment to strike? Or was it the land itself that was to blame? No one could deny that there was an air of malevolence surrounding the area. The deeper Walters dug, the more sinister the story became. The connection between the disappearances wasn't just a matter of coincidence. It was a pattern that for some reason had been concealed for years. It wasn't just a search for a missing child anymore. It was something far darker, and Walters was getting closer to uncovering the truth, whether the town wanted it or not. Detective Sam Walters had been working tirelessly for days, piecing together the fragmented clues that seemed to lead nowhere, and yet at the same time everywhere. Every trail he followed in the woods, every interview he conducted in town, brought him closer to the conclusion that the truth about Evan's disappearance was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. It was the early morning hours when Walters received a call that would change everything. A fisherman who had been out at the lake that morning reported seeing something strange, a figure standing at the edge of the water. The man had been too far away to make out details, but he was certain that it wasn't an animal or a casual hiker. The figure had been motionless, watching the water, just as Walters had seen before. The fisherman had left the area quickly, but something had caught his eye, a set of small, childlike footprints leading away from the water's edge and into the dense forest. Walter's pulse quickened. These weren't the kinds of details that could be dismissed as coincidence. The same footprints from before, leading nowhere, vanishing into the wilderness. This time Walters knew better than to ignore the possibility that Evan might still be out there. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the figure he had glimpsed earlier, the one darting through the trees, was likely not a person at all, but something else. Someone or something that had been watching him. Back in town, Walters paid a visit to the Rhodes house once more. Marissa Rhodes, now visibly shaken by the growing media attention, was reluctant to speak further about her husband's disappearance. But Walters knew that, like it or not, her memories could hold the key to solving the puzzle. "Is there anything at all about Thomas that you haven't told me?" he asked, his voice gentle but insistent. "Something he may have known or heard, anything that might connect his disappearance to Evans?" Marissa hesitated. She avoided Walter's gaze and looked at the floor. It's difficult to explain," she murmured, her voice strained. "Thomas always had this feeling, like something was watching him, especially after he went fishing in those woods. He thought someone had been following him, but he never told me who. I thought he was just paranoid. Maybe it was his mind getting to him after all the stress." Walters leaned in. "Did Thomas ever mention a person or anything about that lake, those woods?" Marissa's eyes widened as though a memory had suddenly surfaced. "There was someone he mentioned a few times. He called him the Watcher. I didn't take it seriously, Sam. He'd say things like, 'The Watcher is out there and he's waiting.' He sounded insane, but it stuck with me. I should have listened." "The Watcher," Walters repeated, his mind racing. "Do you know who he meant?" Marissa shook her head. "No, he never said. But after Thomas disappeared, I started to wonder if there really was someone out there. And now with Evan—" Her words trailed off, leaving a heavy silence between them. The phrase "the Watcher" was chilling in its simplicity. Who was this figure? Was it someone who had been tracking Thomas and now Evan? And what did the Watcher want? Every new detail Walters uncovered only deepened the mystery. The more he learned, the more he understood that whatever was happening in Burden Creek, it wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. This wasn't some random case of a missing child. It was something far more calculated. And with each passing day, the feeling of unease that had settled over the town began to grow, reaching an almost palpable intensity. People were starting to whisper again, their eyes darting nervously over their shoulders. Everyone seemed to be aware of the same fact: something or someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next victim. As Walter stood on the edge of the lake, once more staring into the water, he could feel it, the weight of it, the sense of being watched. The Watcher, as Thomas had called him, was still out there, and he wasn't finished yet. There was no going back now. The darkness was spreading, and Walters had to face it before it took someone else. Detective Walters couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break wide open. Every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and half-truths. The town of Burden Creek, once a quiet and peaceful place, now felt like a place on the edge of collapse. The people who lived there weren't just afraid of what had happened to Evan and Thomas. They were afraid of what might still be out there. A breakthrough came one late afternoon when Walters received a call from a local police officer who had been combing the forest area near the lake. They'd found something. It wasn't a body. It wasn't even a missing persons item. But it was enough to send a chill down Walter's spine: a notebook. Tattered, worn from the elements, but undeniably personal. The officer handed it over to Walters in silence. It was clearly old, the pages frayed at the edges and the ink faded, but the writing inside was legible. It was filled with strange drawings, symbols, and sketches that Walters didn't recognize. At first glance, they seemed harmless, like the ramblings of an artist or a child. But as Walters flipped through the pages, a pattern began to emerge. The sketches were of the very landscape surrounding Burden Creek: the lake, the woods, the narrow paths through the forest. But there was one recurring figure, a dark, shadowy figure in the distance, watching from the trees. The more Walters looked, the more he felt a tightening in his chest. It was the Watcher, the same one that Thomas had mentioned. But this notebook, it didn't belong to Thomas. In fact, it didn't seem to belong to anyone familiar at all. There was no name, no identifying marks. It was as though whoever had written it wanted to remain anonymous, hidden from view. As Walters sat in his office, poring over the strange book, an unsettling thought struck him. The journal was from someone who had been watching Burden Creek for far longer than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't just the case of a man hunting children in the woods. It was something older, something deeply entrenched in the town's history. Could there have been an underground group, or even a single individual, who had been operating in the shadows for decades, unnoticed by the townspeople? What if the missing persons cases were connected in a way that no one had seen before? Evan Thomas, and perhaps others before them, were simply victims of a larger, more disturbing pattern. The implications were chilling. Walters felt a growing sense of urgency. If this was part of something more organized, more methodical, then Evan's disappearance might not be an isolated event. It might be part of a larger scheme, one that had been quietly unfolding for years. He quickly realized he needed help, someone with expertise in old records, town history, and maybe even something darker, folklore. He needed to find out if this watcher had existed in any capacity before. Had anyone in the town heard of him, or was he something new, an apparition from the shadows of Burden Creek's forgotten past? It was a risk, but Walters was running out of options. He had to dive deeper, even if it meant uncovering things better left buried. As Walters began to piece together more fragments of this unsettling puzzle, the atmosphere in Burden Creek became more oppressive. The town, once a close-knit community, had fractured under the weight of fear. Parents kept their children inside after dark. People were afraid to speak to each other, as if afraid that even a whisper could draw the watcher's gaze. But Walters could feel the pressure mounting. He had to find out who was behind the disappearance of Evan and Thomas and why. The watcher was real, and with each passing day Walters felt closer to uncovering the terrible truth. But was it already too late? The watcher was still out there, and if his theory was right, there was no telling how many more would vanish before the truth was finally uncovered.